And now, Carla and Edwidge.
Hello. Hello. I am so excited to be here as a fan and as a friend of Edwidge Danticat. Her accolades are numerous, and we're always crossing our fingers and punching the air when, the National Book Award goes to someone else, and we're like, but it belongs to her. I was telling Edwidge before we got here, before we came up, that, she, even though she wasn't born in Miami, we have embraced her and have adopted her. And if she ever moved, we would have vigil at her home. So I thank you for letting me be a part of this. And she's going to begin with a reading from one of my favorite books. It was the book that I discovered Edwidge with, and I brought the book that I've kept all these years. I used to teach from this book at New World School of the Arts. And this is all of my notes. And I pumped my fist in the air upstairs or downstairs, and I went, I was teaching this book before it was cool. Now it's so cool. And I knew that this book, Crick Crack, was an important book, particularly to kids in this community. Many of us, including myself, being parents of immigrants to this country, and the various stories of how those immigrants come to shore or don't make it to shore, and the things that our parents may be dealing with from their homeland that they don't want to articulate was just amazing to me. And thankfully, I had a lot of students that were touched by it. So I'm going to turn it over to Edwidge now, who's going to read a few pages from my favorite book, Crick Crack.
Thank you. Good evening, or good afternoon, late afternoon, I guess. Thank you all for coming. It's really wonderful to be here. Thank you to the folks at Young Arts, and it's an honor to share the stage with my friend Carla, who's I know you're a talk show hostess in training. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. I am actually when I first moved down here, one of my first immersions, I guess, into Miami life was a party at Marlon and Carla's house, and they host fierce parties, those of you who have attended. So I was like, oh, this might be a nice place to live because these guys are here. So it's wonderful to be. Oh my gosh.
Can I just insert a quick thing? So I knew her husband before, and I didn't know he was dating Edwidge. So he comes to this party, and he's like, oh, let me introduce you to Edwidge. And I'm like, she's standing by my dishwasher. Oh my God, like in my head. And it took everything. And I went to school the next day, and I was like, she was standing by my dishwasher. so thank you for still being my friend.
So I thought, this being Young Arts, and we're still discovering things about each other because I didn't know you won this theater, Young Arts thing. So I'm going to read the epilogue from Crick Crack, and it's called Women Like Us. And when I started writing Crick Crack when I was, some of you Young Arts alum, when I was your age. And so I wrote some of the stories in high school, and some of them I wrote in college. And in post-college even, I had a job where I worked 9 to 5, and I would stay in the office and write short stories from 5 to 9. And the paper was free, and it was still a typewriter back then, but it was an electric typewriter, which was a step up from what I had at home. So a lot of those stories came out of that time. But when I put the stories together, when the stories were in a book, and I started thinking of what it meant for me to be a writer, to come out of an immigrant family and to be a writer in a family where I was told that it was wrong in so many ways. First of all, because we grew up during a dictatorship and you don't want people to know your political business or your personal business. And even though we were living in New York, you still had to be careful about what you said. So the epilogue was really putting together, this idea of giving yourself permission to write. So it's called Women Like Us. And the title comes from a poem by a Jamaican poet, Lorna Goodison. When shadows like dust rise, women like us will, when shadows like dusk falls, as dusk will fall soon here, women like us will rise. So women like us. You remember thinking while braiding your hair that you look a lot like your mother who looked like your grandmother and her grandmother before her. Your mother had 2 rules for life. Always use your 10 fingers, which in her talk meant that you should be the best little cook and housekeeper who ever lived. Your mother's second rule went along with the first. Never have sex before marriage. My children are here. And even after you marry, you shouldn't say you enjoy it or your husband won't respect you. And writing was as forbidden as dark rouge on the cheeks or a first date before 18. It was an act of indolence, something to be done in a corner when you could have been learning to cook. Are there women who both cook and write? Kitchen poets, we call them. They slip meaning into their stew and they slip phrases into their stew and wrap meaning around their pork before frying it. They make narrative dumplings and stuff their daughters' mouths so they say nothing more. But what will she do? What will be her passion? Your aunts would ask when they came over to cook on great holidays, which called for cannon salutes back home, but meant nothing at all here. Her passion is being quiet, your mother would say, but then she's not being quiet. You always hear the scraping from her, crick, crack, pencil, paper. It sounds like someone crying. Someone was crying, you and the writing demons in your head. You have nobody. Nothing but this piece of paper they told you. Only a notebook made out of discarded fish wrappers, pantyhose cardboards. These were the best confidence of a lonely little girl. You remember thinking while braiding your hair that you look a lot like your mother. You remember her silence when you laid your first notebook in front of her. Her disappointment when you told her that words would be your life's work, like the kitchen had always been hers. She was angry at you for not understanding. The family needs a nurse, she said. We need to forge ahead with our heads raised, not buried in scraps of throwaway paper. We do not want to bend over a dusty grave, wearing black hats, grieving for you. There are 999 women who went before you and worked their fingers to coconut rind so you can stand here before me holding that torn old notebook that you cradle against your breast like your prettiest Sunday braids. I would rather you had spit in my face. You remember thinking while braiding your hair that you look a lot like your mother and her mother before her. It was their whispers that pushed you, those thousands of women urging you to speak to the blunt tip of your pencil. Kitchen poets, you still call them. Ghosts like burnished branches on a flame tree. These women, they asked for your voice so that they could tell your mother and your place that yes, women like you do speak, even if they speak in a tongue that's hard to understand, even if it's called patois, dialect, Creole. When you were a little girl, you used to dream that you were lying among the dead and all the spirits were begging you to scream. And even now, you're still afraid to dream because you know that you will never be able to say, to do what they say as they say it, these old spirits that live in your blood. Most of the women in your life had their heads down. They would wake up one morning to find everything gone. It isn't shame, however, that kept their heads down. They were singing, searching for meaning in the dust, and sometimes they were talking to faces across the ages, faces like yours and mine. You remember thinking, while braiding your hair, that you look a lot like your mother who looked like your grandmother and her grandmother before her. Your mother, she introduced you to the first echoes of the tongue that you now speak, when at the end of every day she would braid your hair while you sat between her legs, scrubbing the kitchen pots. As her fingers worked away at the last shadows of her day's work, she would make your braids Sunday pretty, even during the week. When she was done, she would ask you to name each braid after all these women who were boiling in your blood. And since you had written them down and memorized them, these names would just come rolling off your tongue. And this was your testament to the way that these women lived and died and lived again. Thank you.
Thank you, Edwidge. Thank you so much for that piece, because I think it's very important. I remember going to a reading of yours, and you remarked that your brother once said to you, man, I didn't know there were so many things going on in your head. And I wonder when, apart from that job and that sitting there at the typewriter, when did you feel that writing was your path?
Well, I grew up in a house where there were a lot of storytellers. So oral storytellers. My aunts were great storytellers. My grandmother was a great storyteller. So I remember listening to stories and just the lively way that people told stories in my family in a lot of places in the Caribbean, to the interaction. I love that. But I felt like when I was young, I was very shy, and I felt like I could never do that. And I remember that when I was 4, I was given a book, and it was Madeleine in a house in Paris, and it was in French. And I thought, oh, this is really cool, because this is like the story, but you don't have to be in a crowd of people. and it was perfect for me. I thought, oh, this is just whatever this is, that's what I want to do. I really remember having that awareness in that moment. I was like, however that person put that story on the page, I want to do that, even though I didn't realize what a writer was, like how you did that. And so my brother and my cousin, I grew up in a house too where a lot of the children, my mother and father were in New York. My cousin's dad, was in New York. There were some cousins whose parents were in Canada. It was sort of like my uncle and aunt were watching all these kids for parents who were working abroad. So we would sort of get together and we'd make little books. And my brothers, we were also into all kinds of comic books, Tintin, Asterix, and these Western comic books. And so we try to make the little books together. So I remember thinking, like just solidly when I was about 9, I said, oh, this is what I want to do. I don't know how you do it. I don't know if you have to be French or dead, which is all the literature we're reading. But I'm going to find a way.
But, that is a really great point. We're here with the YoungArts Foundation, and their main mission is really encouraging young people to live their dream. And I remember as a teacher, maybe the parents didn't like me so much because I would say, Harvard's not closing. Do what you want to do now. Just do it, live it, feel it, dream it. What would you say to a young person that really has this urge to get out there and do their art, whether it's writing or acting or dancing, but there is this little fear from the parents? We were talking that, in the good old days, the 80s, the 90s, there were I went to Florida State University, and having kids, women and men from Cuban households, from even Caribbean households, going away to school was sort of a new thing in the 90s. And I remember friends who had parents barter with them. Well, if you don't go away, I'll give you a car. So is there any way to win our parents over with the arts? Because they all want us to do better. And then when we say, oh, I found it, they were like, no, you're going to starve. How do we encourage our young people to sort of push forward?
Yeah. Well, it's as time has gone by, I've developed a nuanced approach to this, because my parents they were very much like, so much had been sacrificed for you to be here, like there's people had risked their lives. I mean, the burden, I think for a lot of immigrant kids too, once, if you know the story, people are escaping a dictatorship, they've gone through so much so that you can have a free life and you can have opportunities. Why can't you be a doctor?
Yes, yes.
That's the least you could do. And so my dad, actually, when Breath, Eyes, Memory was on the Oprahs book club.
Yes.
So we watched the show when it airs, and my dad was sick at that time, and he's in bed saying, I'm not gonna have a doctor in the back and then like 10 minutes later, he says, he was like, bring up Albert Schweitzer or something, like one of those people who would go to medical school really late in life and then doing really good
Forget
things.
that you're sitting at Oprah's table.
Like, no, it was, and then he'd say, well, you can always write in the weekend after brain surgery, It went on and on. And I think because also, like now as a parent, you realize when you're inside that situation, you really want your child to have what you think is the safest route. And I think for a lot of our parents, they didn't know this route. So for the young person, I would say yes. I would say like you are probably not the most popular teacher with that. But I would say pursue all that. But I would also say have like a backup plan.
Really?
I would say
you said the backup plan thing?
I would say the backup plan thing.
Wow.
I would say it because most writers I know have another job.
Oh,
yeah.
Truth telling.
So I would say I would say pursue it with all your, but like have you teach, like have a thing. Also, like have another thing. Like,
man, I'm a little like.
I know. I'm sorry, YoungArts. I think it's good to also like. See,
but I understand.
Yeah, but I blindly went into my passion. Like I'm saying this to you as someone who, when I went to do my MFA at Brown, my parents were like, "What are you going to study?" I said, "I'm going to be a teacher."
And they were like, hooray!
No, because I thought, if I have my MFA, I can teach. And so I do think to be also free, you can't be, like the starving artist thing is a rather like myth. You can't be really, really starving and produce your art. You have to eat. So I think you have to at least have this thing of like, how am I gonna eat?
Well, food is essential, and I think that makes sense. I think some of the it is essential. I see a lot of jazz artists that go on and get PhDs, and they still gig on the road, but they are professors at major music universities. So I won't be.
No, and I do think there has to be like, you have to, this is the deal I had made with myself. Like I said, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna give it everything for like I'm gonna do my MFA, I'm gonna just concentrate, I'm gonna do it. But at some point, if it's not working out, I think you have to, you have to kind of have like a discipline. People underestimate the value of discipline in the arts too.
Wow. Talk about that, because I think we only look at musicians and people that have physical instruments that constantly need to make sure that they're fast enough, they're hitting the notes. But as a writer, what is that regimen of discipline?
Oh, I mean, it's the same with with the musicians. Even if you're an actor, you have to take care of your body. You have to go to auditions. You have to, with writers, it's sitting down because people, I think the people who consume the work, they just see you. They see the finished product. But there's a lot of with writers, it's also trusting that the idea. Sometimes when I just started. When I was sort of the young arts age, I never finished anything, and I didn't realize why I wasn't finishing things. But then after a while I realized, my mind, like I have this phenomenal thing in my head that I think is so glorious, but there are only so many words in any language, right? So it was never like I would get halfway and get discouraged because it was never close to that. So the discipline to feel like okay, to tell yourself, first to give yourself permission in the middle of all this stuff too, to say, I can do it, I have a voice. I think that takes a long time for a lot, even older people, to say, I have a voice, I have something to say, and to trust that. And it's different than what other people have to say. And then to sit down, whether you're, I love these stories of writers. You hear like the person has a book, but they spent like 4 years getting up at 3 a.m. and then driving a bunch of hours, and that it takes that kind of discipline. It takes that kind of, routine. So young people sometimes idealize. It's like you go to Mount Olympus and the gods hand it to you.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't happen. At least climbing the mountain is hard work.
Yeah, it doesn't, and I don't think it happens with much of anything. I would be remiss if I don't talk about your work way before. I mean, social media now has granted us the opportunity to really get inside of people's lives and observe things that may not have been in front of us before. So I wanted to talk about your work in terms of making a statement about, about Black men, about immigrant people, and the injustices that they have endured, sometimes simply for being brown, Black, not speaking English. You've been writing about that for a very long time. And it is only now, I think, that these things have become reality to other people because we have people with cameras on their phones and we have people on Twitter getting the word out. I know you as a friend, and then when I read these essays that you've been doing for quite some time, tell me about, we were going to talk about Brother, I Am Dying and what happened with your relative. And this was, before phones, before social media. Do you think anything, first of all, give us a little background on that for the people that don't know. And then do you think that any social media may have changed that situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's two things that come to mind. Last year, I wrote this essay called Enough is Enough after the Michael Brown verdict when the officer was found not responsible. And the first thing that came to mind in that situation was when I was living in Brooklyn. My parents had belonged to this church in Brooklyn for like 30 years that was pastored by the uncle Abner Luima.
Ah, wow.
So he was a family friend, and when that whole thing happened, and our being in the middle of that, and being in the middle of that, and sometimes, some people from the Caribbean will separate themselves from the American reality, or try so hard to separate themselves from the American reality. But growing up in Brooklyn, even in you would be on a bus going to school, and all the bus driver would just have to get upset with something happening, and then police is suddenly on the bus and some kid is getting dragged off. This was before the cameras. And I remember a lot of people who were then saying, well, we came here escaping a dictatorship where this happens, right?
Wow.
And today they had something like, the United Nations or Amnesty International, one of the organizations, like, if these things that are happening in this country were happening in some other country, we'd be so alarmed, There'd be a statement about sort of the human rights violations, if they were happening with the frequency that they've been happening to Black and brown men. And so for me, that goes back way to even before Abner, you had Amadou Diallo,
That's right.
and so we were on the Brooklyn Bridge, we were like with the protesting, and it seemed like so little had changed. So that night at the verdict, I said, let me call up Abner and see what he thinks about this. And then and he was the same. He was like, there's only been one conviction of one police officer, and this happened to me. And so we talked about that. But even with my uncle died in immigration custody here in Miami when he was 81 years old. There was some trouble in Haiti, and he came over. He had a visa, but he said he needed asylum, and he was in prison. His medication was taken away. He died in custody here. As I've gotten older too, I've realized sort of how before we saw these issues as separate, and I think there were these struggles within the communities to see, what's happening to our young men, meaning like sort of Haitian guys, happening with immigration. it's linked with what's happening to brown men on, you know, on the streets of America. You know, it's white supremacy. It's sort of, it affects us all. And so I think these things is as the generations go on, you see more of like sort of the commingling of these issues. So you have the groups that now are very active in immigration issues. They are also with Black Lives Matter. They're also at Ferguson. It's like that ally, you know, these allyships are being built, and young people are doing that, and they're doing it in politics, but they're also doing it through the arts, you know, and they're all this commingling. I think is very important to see if we're going to see tides turn, and sort of like these voices coming together for each other's causes.
You know, there's a great quote that, you know, as people look in history, they don't look at your wars, they look at your art. And I think that there have been some really significant pieces of art, visual. Look at the Oscars with John Legend and Common winning the Oscar for their song from Selma. Art is so powerful. So you're part of a really powerful network of people. So we thank you for that, for being that voice when it wasn't, you know, when it wasn't out there and it wasn't hashtagged everywhere, you know?
Well, I think it's, you know, social media has a great role in that, and especially for young people, and with being here with Young Arts too, I think as people are finding their voices, especially young people, sometimes they make it so narrow. You know, you're either art for art's sake, or you're political art. You know, it's like and sometimes it's confusing for young people because they feel like, well, maybe I don't want to be all that political, you know, but I'm also not arts for art's sake, you know, where do I, and so art is a constant discovery, and citizenship is also part of it, you know, because just like the hunger thing, you know, if your community is in turmoil, it makes it's also, you know, the art reflects it. And that's one of the things that's very powerful about Haitian art, for example. It's always somehow absorbed what's happening and found some way to reflect it, you know,
that's
either like exaggerated, either very pretty, or, you know, a satire, or there's some way.
Very, very true, very true. I'll lighten it a little bit and ask about some moments. You're an internationally acclaimed artist, and I'm always curious about your moments of fandom. Is there someone that you're a fan of that has ever come to you like, oh my God, you're Edwidge Danticat, and you're like, oh my gosh, you're...
Well, it's not to that level of fandom, but a couple of years ago, Toni Morrison was doing this thing at the Louvre, where she was curating at the Louvre for a month. She was doing these programs, and my oldest Mira, who's here, was just a baby, and so she calls, and it's like, it's Toni Morrison, and I said, Ms. Morrison, and she's like, will you come to Paris? And I said, well, Ms. Morrison, I just had this baby. She's like, what do you need for the baby? So I said, my husband and 2 grandmas. Like, let them come.
Oh, man.
So I got to hang out with her at the Louvre, and recently, so they're making a film about like 10 years later.
Wow.
So then I got recently to go to her house and gone, you know, and had upstate New York, and we talked about the Louvre experience, and so I almost, like, I remember when I was leaving, I kissed her forehead, and I said in my head, I can tell people we're friends now. So that's like my ultimate moment of fandom.
Oh, that's great. And as an artist, I know that you know, Young Arts does a lot of things interdisciplinary. Have you? I think you did some things in film. Yes. Yeah. Have you thought about exploring more in other dimensions or collaborating with other artists in other disciplines?
Oh yeah, I love collaborations. Recently, I did something with someone you know, Daniel Bernard-Womain.
Oh yay!
Yeah, we did. Daniel Bernard-Womain is a violinist, a sort of classical composer, but I've seen him play like a woman's body, like the violin. He does things with the violin that you would not imagine.
It's true. He's great.
Yeah,
He's great.
and so we did this like he called it a mono opera. It's like a small with one character on Anacaona, who was Anacaona was a Taino woman who was a leader in Haiti, in the region where my family's from.
I see. Oh, great. So is that going to premiere anywhere soon?
It premiered in Atlanta like in March, and he hopes to bring it to Miami next May.
All right.
Yeah.
So we have something to look forward to. And of course, we can't talk to Edwidge without, your really your portrayal of women. In Crick Crack, my favorite short story in there is Night Women. And Night Women is the story of a mother, but she is a prostitute at night. But it is what she has to do to help her family. And I come away from that because, of course, the sex is forbidden territory with girls, with women, particularly, immigrant families. They want us to be independent, but then with that topic, forget about it. It's still old-fashioned stuff. But you walk away from that story and you feel, and she's so empowered and she's so powerful. And I just wanted to know personally more about that story. Because it just flipped everything that we were taught on its ear for me. Do you have any little tidbits about that one?
If people haven't read it, actually, it's one of my favorite stories in the book too. It's a story called Night Women, and it's a mother she does this whole shadow play because she lives in a very small room with her son. So she creates, and she's a lady of the evening, and she creates all these stories for him about what's happening, so that he's not affected by the actual thing. And so in that story too, what I wanted to use a lot of the Caribbean mythology about sort of like, even with sort of these goddesses who seduce people out of the sea, or sort of these mirage, the beautiful women you can never really have, and maybe play with that motif in literature, where it's sort of like the poor woman of the night who coughs and then dies of tuberculosis or something. But reverse that this woman has control over that. I mean, it falls a little bit, I think, into the debate about sex workers in general. Like, when do people have agency? When don't they have agency? And so this woman doesn't have much of a choice, but she's really, the parts that she can control, she tries very hard to control. And I think it's a thing also. I feel like, especially in Crick Crack, I tried to write about this family of women, not just for the sake of writing about strong women, but of reflecting all these women I knew in my own life growing up, who were women in my immediate family who were women of modest means, but who were very entrepreneurial, who were just very, would find a way, like the Haitian proverb said, "Cap fait beurre à l'eau," who are making butter out of water, who finds some way to do it. And sometimes it could be in this type of situation, but they're really, it's like in Creole we say the women are the potomitan, or like the middle pillar of the society. And sometimes it's not always, even the women who appear the strongest have to sometimes do things that they may not want to do, but in this little space that she can control, take over that type of control.
Wow, that's great. I think that it was very powerful for me, just because it is, and it does reflect this wish of all of our mothers, I feel, of being more powerful here in the States than they would have been. I remember the reason this book spoke to me is because my mother said very clearly to me that she was not going to put me in the kitchen like she was to be prepared for a husband.
Mm-hmm.
So, honey, that's why I don't cook. You know, it's like cereal. When he's not here, it's like cereal. Vitamins, minerals, calcium. So I feel that and my mother was very, very, very adamant about that. Mm-hmm. So now that you're a mom and your latest book, forgive me for the title, Claire of the Sea Light. Of the Sea Light. Mm-hmm. Claire of the Sea Light. And I know a certain person in the audience is on the cover. Now that you're a mom and you have these two beautiful young women, you know, people always want to know, has your writing changed? Do you think about going in a new direction now that you're a mom, or are there things that you think about? So as a mom, what is writing now, considering this very present theme of strong women?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think a lot of things get revised when you become a parent. Like that whole thing with like the backup plan. That's since I knew it. That's since I became a parent, because I don't want to be supporting anybody for the rest of their lives. It's like when you become a parent, it's like I think your heart gets bigger. You get more afraid of certain things. So there are certain things I can't read anymore. Like I can't read those things of children in extreme danger.
Oh, wow.
Like I can't. I mean, I think, and it's the same maybe for writing. You would write it with I would write it with a very different perspective. You know, sort of like with myself and my family in mind and things like that. So there's the actual layers of what you're writing about, sort of like the concerns of sort of how you're projected or things are projected into the future are very, very different time-wise. And I know young women, for example, always worried about that as sort of your art. And you know, like, I mean, there's always a give and take. Sure. I mean, it's I went to Barnard College, so a very big women's college, and they would always say, you know, when I was there, like the first 2 years, they said, you can have it all, you can have it all. And then the last 2 years, like, you can have it all, but not at the same time. So you work around, and I think, and also it's made me, you know, there's a whole movement. We need diverse voices in terms of, you know, for the young writers out there, in terms of a range of what our children consume, and when you have young children, you start worrying about that. You start all the hair things. You're like, I want my child to feel good in their skin, and I want to find work like that, and you're kind of on a quest for that. And so if you're a writer, you feel like, oh, I want to produce for that age group as well. So I've started writing more. Like I have a picture book coming out in the fall, and a young adult book around the same time. So I feel like I want to also write for that age group as a parent. I mean, there is some work out there, but there's a lot more that can not just represent, you know, not just put a Black child or a child of color in an isolated setting, but in the world that we live in now, which is such a much more multicultural world, and in terms of like where nothing is really isolated, and to have work that reflects that they can identify with, that they can also see themselves in. Because I remember, I know you feel that when you are young and you read a book where you're like, oh my God, that's my life. Yes. You know, even as an older person, that means so much. I mean, we read to escape, but when you read something that you feel like, oh, this person was in my head, it's almost like, you know, it's such a great revelation.
Absolutely. We have just a few minutes before we turn it over to our audience to get some questions from them. But again, the whole Young Arts mission and the fact that the Arrisons chose to put roots in Miami is significant. And they did it at a time when, you know, Miami wasn't that hip place to be. What keeps you in Miami, and what are you excited about? We're so happy to have you here as one of our citizens of Miami-Dade County. what are you excited about this city? Because there's something bubbling, and I'm so excited to be here. Mm-hmm. Is it the same for you?
Is what's bubbling? Is it besides all the real estate? Well, I've been here like 13 years now, and I have never seen. And I lived in New York City. I lived in New England a little bit. I've never seen a city change. Maybe it's the time that I came. I've never, there was a point sort of halfway through my stay where there were like 40 cranes down Biscayne, and you just kind of see a city growing around you. I think one of the wonderful things about the city is sort of like it's like a true melting pot. There's so many cultures here. There could be more interaction. But there's just so many. There's access to so many things. It's like a little bit of the world of here. It certainly is here. All the and you're so close. We're always so close to home here.
It's true. So I think it's a beautiful testament to our community. So Edwidge Danticat, thank you.
Thank you.
We are going to take your questions. Now is your time to ask her anything you like, except maybe how much she weighs and all that good stuff. So, yes. Esther's going to come for you.
I'm actually curious about your writing schedule now that since you had children, how did it change?
Okay. Well, before I had my girls, I would, I moved from Brooklyn, and my first apartment alone was in New Rochelle, a little town outside of New York City. And I used to call it a writer's colony of one. And when I was working on a project, I would hold myself up in there, I just would get Chinese food come in, and I could do sort of a binge writing. I would do that. That was really how I would write. I would binge write. I can't do that anymore. But what it does though is that it makes you more disciplined. I do a lot more planning in my head, and also you do a lot less time wasting. So I'm not, so if I have 2 hours, I'm just going to sit and do my 2 hours because I know then I'll have to go get the girls at school at some point. So it makes you a little more disciplined. I heard Jhumpa Lahiri answer that question, and she says, well, you have more things to write about and less time to do it. Oh. So you have to, you really have to work your way around that.
Any other questions?
Where do you get the inspiration for your books, and what would you say is the most difficult part of your writing process?
Where do I get the inspiration for my books? I get them from pretty much anywhere. I try to stay woke, as the young people say. You try to stay aware, you try to observe, and I find that, most people, once you start getting in the practice of your art, whether it's photography or whether it's cinema or writing, you develop a kind of eye. You sort of you have these antennas that are out, and certain things you're like, oh, this would make a great picture, or this would make a great story. You start picking things up. So the inspiration is everywhere, and also in history. And sometimes you just wake up with a character in mind. Claire of the Sea Light was like that. I had watched a documentary about Haitian children who were given away by their families, and one of sort of a missionary in the documentary said, oh, these people, they don't care about their children as much, or something like that. And that night I went to sleep, and the next morning I woke up with sort of this, almost this character, like Clara's character, this close to my face. And I thought, oh yes, I must write, about you. So it comes in different ways. But I think it's important in terms of, sometimes when people ask that question, you're asking in a way that you hope it's reproduced. But say if you're a young artist, I would say you jot things down, you take notes, you observe, you eavesdrop. You definitely become like you become a big eavesdropper when you become a writer, because you never know when you'll get some ideas for a dialogue pattern or things like that. You just are very observant, read a lot, and not just novels, but also read history. You read the paper. You really are just, and participate fully in life, because that's the other thing too. Before, it was always recommended that before you become a writer, you go out and live a little bit, and that's debatable how. Maybe we're always living, and then there's some people who said if you've survived your childhood, you have plenty to write about for the rest of your life.
All right.
Because you started writing so very young, and you have a lot of essays and social commentary, I'm wondering that now that you have the benefit of hindsight, is there anything you changed your mind about, or that you'd like to take another stab at?
Yeah, quite a few things. I mean, I think that's part of getting older, and Zadie Smith has a book of essays called Changing My Mind. And her whole idea of these essays is that, you can even, sometimes even across the process of writing something, you thought, especially the opinion pieces, you thought you were going in with a very firm opinion of something, and as you write more, you read more, you then, it becomes, you can see more of the other side. So absolutely, and certainly, I wish I could rewrite all. I mean, they wouldn't be the same books, but there's sometimes you read something, you're like, oh my God, I wish I could rewrite that. But but there's also some value to a fresh response to something, and I think for the young writers too, you shouldn't be afraid of, if you feel passionately about something in the moment, you shouldn't be so afraid of expressing it because you're afraid later you'll regret it, because probably you will, but but it's important to also, I think, to trust that fresh instinct, because I think that's where a lot of great art comes from. Like, if there are things that if you blink you'll miss it, you won't have that same passion as you have like in that moment that you spit it out. Like Jack Kerouac and all those guys can certainly attest for that. A lot of the drugs help, but their passion also was part of it.
Hearing you talk about your relationship to your daughters, maybe wonder about your relationship to the big family of books that you have. And I'm thinking about those bestsellers, Brother, I'm Dying, that are somewhat easy to find, but there's these little gems like your Carnival book, or even the Anacona, which isn't easy to get anymore. How do you feel about sort of the different ways in which your books circulate?
Yeah. Well, the different ways that the books circulate, it's funny because for me with each book, it's in the moment that you're writing the book, it's like the big love, and you're writing it because you're so consumed and you so love it. And then I always, I have these books coming out, and you get afraid for them, because then they enter this cycle then of the reviews and of the good reads where people can be so terrible. And but I always try to, that part of it is very hard to control. Books that you think will do really well don't do well, and books that for Brother, I'm Dying, for example, I wrote that in the year after I lost my father and my uncle, and my daughter was born, and I thought, I have to just get this out of me. And I felt like it would be, if I didn't write it, I wouldn't be able to write another book until I got that out of me. Because I think some works too, like I always say to young people, there are things that if you don't write them, it's like a big stone in front of you, like it blocks other work.
Wow. So
even if you don't publish it, like I feel like this was going to be that kind of book for me. I didn't think anybody would want to read it. I thought it's like, it would be great at least for my family, for my niece and nephew who didn't know these stories. And so it really was a labor of love. And then it did better than other books, that I expected. But that's the only thing you can control about anything you write or anything you do as an artist is the work, and you do the very best you can, and the rest of it really is up to other people. But I'm lucky that my Carnival book is now back in print. It's in a new vintage edition. We updated it with a new color photograph, and I was very happy about that. It's like 13 years old now. And so, these things go ebbs and flows. So look at Zora Neale Hurston. It took her so long for Their Eyes Were Watching God to be rediscovered. And I think it's just like if you write something out of passion, and I write all my things out of passion because they take a lot out of me. And they'll find the reader. And even if that reader is like really 20 passionate people who feel like they couldn't have had a good life without that book, that's enough.
Do we have time for more questions?
I just had a question about language. I read that your characters in your head is speaking Creole, and then you translate it. You are the translator of your character. Can you talk a little bit about language and working on that?
The question of language is, I used to worry so much more about it more than I do now, because the question of language when I was starting out would often decide sort of where people want to put you. So there would always be, Julia Alvarez has a wonderful essay called Something to Declare about this question of language, where she went to the Dominican Republic to a conference for writers. And this thing happened to her. That's happened to at least a couple of my friends when they have that same thing, where some great writer from your original homeland stands up in your presence and either denounces you, and says, come, if you want to be one of us, you have to write in this language, whether it's Spanish or. So she writes about that, where she writes, like weeks later, after having been horrified by this confrontation, a response. And the language, for a lot of us, it's not a choice. It's sort of the time of our migration, the circumstances of our migration. And I do, a lot of my characters do speak in Creole, and I realize that I'm doing a kind of simul translation. And it's been wonderful, though, as time has gone by, to see all these other writers who are in the same kind of situation, like Junot Diaz, Sandra Cisneros, and Juno's book, Drown, he has the epigraph of the Cuban poet, I'm forgetting his name, where it says, it says, the fact that I'm speaking to you in English somewhat falsifies what I'm saying. I don't belong to English, but I don't belong anywhere else either. So this is like the Firma, I forget the name of the poet, but it's a beautiful inscription that just kind of opens the conversation. And there's so many of us, and I think of this literature too, that's sort of this somewhat bilingual, somewhat hyphen, somewhat middle place literature. People like my brothers need it, like these kids who came at this time, and there's so many of us who are producing it. So I think the issue of language, the original language so nourishes the English that we produce. It's always behind it. It's like the film behind it. And English is one of those languages that's so stretchy. You could have Toni Morrison's English, you have the Shakespeare English, you have the Faulkner English, you have the rapper's English, and you have the immigrant writer's English, And so to me, that it used to be when people asked that question, they were indicting us. It's like, hey, why don't you write in your own language, or why don't you? But now that there's more and more of us, it feels necessary. And also it's like, it's a space. But the advantage of the language, I found out after a while, is that it would take my relatives, because the books get translated into French, I felt so much freer writing, because it would take my relatives like a year to read the translation. And I felt there was also a freedom in that veil. It's like, oh, I don't have to, there are words that I think I would never allow myself to say in Creole, because it would be like in Creole, we say, pas respecter figi maman. It's like not respecting your elders by writing, but things that I feel like, because it's not my first language, I'm freer writing.
We're on our final question.
Thank you.
I wanted to know, with feel to be writing about certain parts of history? For example, the Crick Crack and things like that. But how do you, would you want to choose that into like doing multidisciplinary work, or?
You know, I have tried, but as you said, Carla, I worked in film, and every time I do love collaboration, but every time I step out of my discipline, I'm so happy to go back, because all you need to be a writer is a pen and a notebook. You don't need actors. You don't need, so I'm always open to sort of the the disciplinary part, but in terms of, just like letting the work out. But history, for example, I think I wrote a book called The Farming of Bones, and if we get technical, if it's like performed history, right? It's about this massacre of cane workers in the Dominican Republic, and it's based on a very true story. And so I like also to explore, even in the narrow milieu of my writing, sort of how we enter history, like the individual voices in history, and sort of how people engage history. So I like that I'm also able to do that with and not just also recent history, because for us, like, unearthing history is so, even living in Brooklyn was such a dangerous thing. Like, you could be at church in Brooklyn and everybody recognizes the torturer in the third row.
Wow.
But nobody's saying anything. They're whispering.
Wow.
And it would be like, and I would think, I remember, these are very forgiving people, or are they afraid, or, so I think it's, for me, there's things like you can place characters, you can place fictional characters to interact with history or with science or with all these things. Like, that's what's exciting too about writing, in terms of, and that's why one of the advice that I would give people who want to be writers is to read in all the different disciplines, to learn because when you create characters who do different things, you have to inhabit them, you have to really know who they are. And someone was saying that there's not enough writing about work, especially working class people. There are not enough characters who are just working.
That's interesting.
They're shopping, they're suffering, but there's not enough characters. So things like that, I think, could be aided by people just exploring what it is like to inhabit different bodies in the world, also put different things, to have different knowledge, and sometimes knowledge that are contradictory, that don't, that sort of like, I mean, you have to be an artist. You also have to be able to hold multiple, sometimes contrary ideas in your head.
Wow. So everyone, thank you for coming out.